In April of 1980, a flood in Ecuador unearthed the bodies of 4 children. This happening at the same time as the area had been hit with a large amount of missing children led authorities to believe that they had a murderer on the loose. Their fears would be confirmed as they would later discover that these 4 bodies were just a fraction of the much larger and scarier picture that the monster of the Andes painted. Find out who Pedro Lopez really was on today's episode of the TM Podcast. Welcome back to the TM Podcast. I am Travis, and today will be another Patreon subscriber request. And thanks to Carrie, I'll be talking about what might be the vaguest case that I think that I've looked into since I started podcasting. Due to the lack of information in detail, it has been extremely difficult to figure all this out, but here we are. It's been a very weird week. The helicopter crash in Calabasas with all those people on top of the coronavirus thing, now an earthquake. And if you're wondering why there's such a delay between my regular post of this podcast and me posting this on YouTube, it's because of a couple of things. One of them being I don't do them at the same time because the setup has to be a little different, if that makes any sense. And also, my wall fell off in my studio, so the lighting was really bad until I could make some quick changes. And if you're wondering why the background is a little bit different this time, it's because it's the first actually kind of warm day where I am in Alabama, and what that means is that every single person with a Harley in a 10-mile radius comes by my house and revs it up as loud as possible. So I'm having to change things up a little bit to hopefully keep it a little quieter so you don't hear what's going on in the background. Quick disclaimer for this episode, this guy killed young children, so keep that in mind as you're listening. I will not be going over each and every individual name involved, as the episode would probably take about a week, and he also didn't know all the names of the people anyways. I'll give as much detail as possible in the most respectful way that I can. That being said, whatever you're listening or watching this episode on, please like, subscribe, follow, retweet, and scream it at the top of your lungs in public. Thank you. So, Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in Colombia on October 8, 1948. His father was a man named Medardo Reyes, and he was shot and killed before Pedro was born. This was during a time of conflict in the area called La Violencia. His mother, Benilda Lopez de Castaneda, was a local sex worker who had to now give birth to a new son without the father's presence. This proved to be a horrifying situation for Pedro and his siblings. Their house only had one bed for the 13 children that Benilda had. I'm not sure if there were other rooms in this house or not, but what is known is that Benilda continued to sell herself in the presence of her children. The only thing separating her servicing her clients and the 13 kids was a small curtain. It's one thing to hear something like that as a child one time, much less every single night. This would obviously confuse and corrupt the mind of anyone, much less children, in this type of financial situation and location. When Pedro was just 8 years old, Benilda caught him touching his sister's breast and kicked him out of the house. An 8-year-old. I'm not questioning the moral compass of sex workers in general, but Benilda specifically should have been able to understand that if all this kid is seeing and hearing is sex every single night, is it really his fault that he did that, or your fault for not teaching him that that was inappropriate? It should have been a teaching point, not a reason to evict an 8-year-old that didn't understand what was happening. That being said, this element of Pedro's history comes from him directly, so it is very possible that it was something much more sinister, and he's just lying about it. Either way, he was out on the streets in a terribly violent area as a child and quickly found that the world was a very brutal and unforgiving place. All he knew to do was to beg people for food and water, but he didn't have much luck. One day, a man noticed him begging and offered him food and a place to stay. The man seemed a bit off, but in his tired and hungry state, he didn't have the luxury of turning anything down. Unfortunately, the man was a predator, and instead of giving Pedro food and shelter, he just took him to an abandoned building and sexually assaulted him. When the man was done, he just threw Pedro right back out onto the streets. So this was a pivotal moment in what would shape Pedro as a person. He is quoted as saying that this specific incident with a stranger made him take a vow to himself that he would do the same exact thing to as many little girls as he could. And that absolutely mentally handicapped logic followed him for the rest of his life. I guess in his mind it made sense, but to any other person with a real brain, that is the dumbest justification for those types of crimes that I've ever heard. Little girls had absolutely nothing to do with any of the trauma that he ever received. I get that he felt wronged by the world, which is fair, but if you're going to hurt anyone, why not hurt child molesters? Anyways, after the incident, he did his best to stay away from people during the daytime. He would go out in the night and scavenge for food instead of beg. He eventually ended up in a town called Bogota, and I'm not sure how I'm supposed to pronounce that, and an American couple saw that he was having to scavenge around for food and water and decided that they would take him in. They enrolled him in a school for orphans, and it seemed like everything was looking up for young Pedro. But when he was 12 years old, one of his teachers allegedly molested him, and that was the straw that broke Pedro's back and put him into the mindset that he would never come out of. After that happened, he stole money from his new family and ran away. He started begging for food again in the streets and realized that he could instead steal things and sell them for money to buy his own food. He got by on doing this for a while, but eventually graduated to larger crimes like stealing cars instead of just small items. This would eventually catch up to him, though, as he was arrested at the age of 18 for car theft. In prison, his experience with life continued to spiral out of control. He was attacked by 4 men who held him down and raped him. In that moment, he made another promise to himself that he would never be violated again. He made a knife out of some materials that he found within the prison and killed 3 of the 4 men who had attacked him. Believe it or not, only 2 years was added to his sentence because they viewed what he did as self-defense. The rest of the time that he was locked up, all he did was browse porn magazines and think about how much he hated his mother. This hate would build up inside of him to the point that he decided that as soon as he was released, he was going to start killing young girls. He kept to his promise, and as soon as he was released in the late 70s, he started luring young girls in Peru by offering them gifts if they followed him. He says that once that he had convinced a small child to follow him, he would take them to a location he had already prepared. He would then rape them and choke them to death. That wouldn't be it, though. After a girl would die, he would prop her body up and have conversations with it. When he would get bored of talking to just one, he would go out and kill another, and bring her body to sit beside the first. He would repeat this until he was bored with all of them or they started to decompose. And then he would bury them in a shallow grave together. He would then repeat this process again and again and again. The local authorities were aware that little girls were going missing, but they believed that the children were being sold to sex trafficking and didn't really do too much investigating into the locals. By the end of the 70s, he claimed that he had killed over 100 young girls this way. It was at that time he was actually caught trying to lure a young girl away from her parents by a local tribe. The tribe took him in and tortured him. Their law stated that he should be executed by being buried up to his head and honey or molasses poured over his face so that insects like ants could slowly eat him. Lucky for him and unfortunately for us, there was an American Christian missionary visiting the tribe, and she convinced them to not kill him, but to turn him over to the police. I honestly wonder where she is now and how terrible she must feel about knowing that that decision to let him go indirectly led to the death of at least 200 other girls. The police only held him for a short period of time before releasing him back into the public. After being released, he moved to Ecuador and continued his killing spree. He claimed that he killed at least 3 girls a week for a long period of time because the girls there were very trusting and easy to take. In 1980, there was a flood in Ecuador that uncovered the body of several girls who had obviously been strangled to death. Their opinion that the young girls were being kidnapped and sold into sex trafficking quickly changed upon the examination of the bodies. Some of the girls had been choked so violently that their eyes had popped out of their skulls. It was clear that there was a serial killer that was responsible and they needed to find him fast. Pedro's frequent kidnapping wouldn't last forever, as he would be caught again trying to take a young girl from a market. Some locals witnessed and attacked him and held him down until police could arrive. When they arrested him, they suspected that he could be the one that's killing all the girls. He said that he was innocent and the police really didn't have any way of proving that he was lying, so they had to figure out a way to get him to confess. They brainstormed and ultimately came up with the idea of putting a local priest in prison with him as a cellmate to try to get all the information out of him. The priest was disguised as a criminal, and Pedro was led to believe that he was also a pedophile rapist. The priest told Pedro stories of the crimes that he had committed to build up his trust. Eventually, the disguise worked, and Pedro unloaded his terrifying claims of kidnap, rape, and murder to the priest, who I'm assuming was terrified after that point. He had to have feared for his life during that time between that conversation and getting out of there. The police confronted Pedro after his confession, and he confirmed that he was in fact the man responsible for the deaths of the missing girls. He would go on to confess that he had killed around 110 girls in Ecuador, at least 100 in Colombia, and 100 in Peru. He told police that he would always kill in the daytime so that he could see the life leave his victims' eyes. He also called his conversation with the corpses, quote, tea parties. The police didn't initially believe him for obvious reasons, but he agreed to take them to burial sites. All in all, he led them to 53 bodies that were still in place. The police believed that local wildlife and erosion had taken the ones that they could not locate, as they were all buried so poorly. When the public caught wind of his crimes, they called him the Monster of the Andes. He pled guilty to the murders of over 100 girls and was sent to prison. He was interviewed several times, in which he claimed to be the man of the century and no one would ever forget him. He also said that if he were ever to be released, he would kill again and felt absolutely no remorse for his crimes. This is normally the end of a story, but in an appalling twist, there's actually a limit to how many years that you can spend in prison in Ecuador. So the man who claimed to have killed over 300 people was released from prison in 1994, only serving 14 years, getting out 2 years early on good behavior. He wasn't just freed, though, because as soon as they let him out of prison, he was arrested again and deported to Colombia, where he was tried for a 20-year-old murder case. This time, he wasn't sentenced to prison. They determined that he was mentally insane and sent him to a psychiatric hospital to be evaluated and rehabilitated. Only 4 years later, in 1998, the hospital determined that he was now mentally healthy and ready to go back into society. They released him on a $50 bail and a conditional agreement that he would check back in periodically, similar to probation in the United States. But he didn't check in, and he has never been heard from since. In 2002, Colombian police issued an announcement that he was suspected of a murder that happened that year, but he could not be located, and as of today, he is believed to be alive and still out there. If that is true, he would be about 72 years old. There are a few theories about what happened after his release, one being that as soon as he was released, he went right back to killing and won't stop until he dies. I hope that isn't true, but I believe that if he is still out there, he kept to his word and continued on. Another is that he is back in jail for another crime, but I was not able to find any information on that, so I don't believe that that one is true. The most broadly accepted theory is that when he was released, the police killed him. This is because they knew he would just go out and kill again, so the only option that they had was to kill him in secret and quietly make their country a little bit safer. It's a theory that I believe and hope happened. The fact that he was last seen being escorted by police and has never been seen since leads me to believe that they took him somewhere secluded and killed him. We can only hope. There were also several bounties on his head from local families, so I believe that it solved itself either way. This episode was exceptionally hard to do, as there really isn't that much information on this guy, and I chalk that up to the time period and the area. There was a lot going on there, and their resources aren't anything like it is here and now. There are a million different contradicting stories, some saying that he only killed a few people and some confirming over 300. Personally, I believe that he did do what he said. And if you're wondering why I believe him and not Richard Kuklinski from the last episode, it's because he led police to bodies, he remembered some names, and he never changed his story. The guy was, or is, incredibly terrifying, and I hope the police or some local took him out and will never have to hear from him again. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments of this post or by messaging me directly at tmpodcast19@gmail.com. If you'd like to decide what content that I cover like Carrie did today, head on over to patreon.com/the TM Podcast and become a part of that community. Please remember to like, subscribe, follow, and share the podcast on whatever media that you're on. And as always, thank you for listening to the TM Podcast.